I said earlier, it's great to be with all of you. And, you know, I share your passion for education, but also those in business. I understand the critical importance of what commerce and business brings to the table. So what we're going to do together in the next hour and a half or so is really a multi-directional conversation about the future that you're all facing, that we're all facing. I was fascinated by the question that was asked earlier. What does the future require us to be? And contained in that question, I guess, is an assumption that you can't be the same person you are today and succeed in the future. Now, it raises questions about where should we be investing our time and effort in developing ourselves. But I think critically at this time, it raises questions about where should businesses be investing, where should schools be investing to adapt to this time. It's very interesting when I listen to the response to COVID. Very often the response to COVID has been dominated by a discourse that says COVID has disconnected us. We're not going to school, we're at home, we're not at work, we're at home. It's sort of forcing societies, forcing families to be disconnected. But what's very interesting is COVID has also accelerated our ability to connect. So I mentioned this project that I've been doing in Africa, where we've been connecting with people from 15 African countries. Because of COVID, we're connecting much more quickly, much more efficiently. And so as we ask that question we had earlier, which is, what does the future require us to become? Part of answering that question means making the best of the moment that we're in, you know, taking advantage of the opportunities that are contained in the crisis. And so what I would like to do with you in the next few minutes is to explore with you what might the future hold. We're going to use some tools from scenario planning as a method to do that together. But really what we're going to do is explore together in a way that allows one participant to learn and benefit from the other participant as they sense make about their world, and as they sense make about their future. There'll be lessons in that for all of us, and I'll use scenario planning as a method to do that. Let me share my slides here for a moment. I'm going to be drawing on some content here that we use in the Gibbs MBA. I teach an elective on the MBA called Mastering Strategic Foresight, and I'm drawing on some of that content here to share with you. And of course, under the topic, how do we think and organize when things are uncertain? And really focusing in on what is strategic leadership during the time of COVID and post-COVID. What is strategic leadership going to be about? And how do we, whether it's as educators or business people, how do we think about leadership? How do we do it? What is it that we do? And so to start with that, I'm going to put a question to us as participants. And the question is, a strategist is what? What is a strategist? How would you describe a strategist? And I'm going to tag a couple of you here and see if you have a sense. You can pick one of these words that I've put on the slide. You know, is a strategist an advisor? Are they a commander? Or are they a designer? Are they a seer or an engineer? Let me have a look here. Anastasia, I'll come to you first, if that's okay, and then to Karen Yankees. Anastasia, if you had to say, you know, what is a strategist, a strategic leader? What is it? What do they do? What would you describe them as? So Anastasia, you're muted at the moment. I'm not sure you got my question. Let me unmute you. There, I've asked you to unmute Anastasia, and then once you've had a go, we'll go to Karen. Go ahead, Anastasia. So Anastasia doesn't seem to be unmuting. Karen, can I come to you and then we'll circle back to Anastasia? Karen also doesn't seem to be hearing me. Not sure if the connection is slow. Karen, let me give you another go. So neither Karen nor Anastasia seem to be responding to my request. Let me have a look here. Felix.
Susan has a raised hand. Susan Hanekom.
I see. Let me, Susan, go ahead.
I would say it's a planner.
A planner? And explain to me why you picked planner out of all those options.
Because as you strategize, you analyze and you think how you're going to develop further. So it's actually taking everything in consideration, you plan what you want to achieve.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Susan. And so the question that raises, given our topic here for today, is how do you plan in a time that is fundamentally uncertain? I think Justin mentioned in the beginning, there's so many uncertainties even before COVID. The word planning contained in it, sort of at a quite a fundamental level, to plan means to be certain, to say, I'm going to take step A, B, C, D, right? So how do you plan if you're in an environment that is so fundamentally uncertain? Let me come back to Anastasia. Anastasia, did you have a view?
I think a leader.
A leader? And explain your,
and the reason
your
I
choice.
say a leader is someone who's visionary. A leader also uses the resources in order to plan ahead, taking into consideration challenges, obstacles that might present itself. So a leader has, vision and foresight, and so he plans ahead, strategizes, to overcome the obstacles or the challenges he may encounter or may foresee.
Thank you, Anastasia. And I love that response, that it's a combination, and you've sort of touched on a few critical topics there. Vision was mentioned, strategy, planning was mentioned, but also resources and obstacles. And so we get the sense that a strategist is a leader or someone who can see a vision and then use the resource at their disposal to move towards that vision. Now, if I think back for a minute here to January, I'm sure most school leaders and educators and business people had a vision for the year. They had a strategy for the year. But then you mentioned something else which was interesting, which is to foresee. And then to deal with those challenges, to foresee. Now, if we take that word, if we get technical as an educator for a minute, foresee has got, of course, the suffix and the prefix to foresee, to see before. Talk to me about this word foresee or foresight. What's the opposite of foresight, Anastasia?
I would say is to have a closed mind, your mind is closed off. So you're operating basically in the past and in the now.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Anastasia and I have been passing crypt notes in the background, it sounds like, because she's got all the right answers, right? That the opposite of foresight is actually what's called hindsight. And so we often have the saying where we say hindsight is 20/20. As a business leader, if you knew in January what you know in July, you would have made very different decisions about investment, about staffing, and that's called hindsight. And we say hindsight is 20/20 because looking back, it's like we can see perfectly. And then you have hindsight, which is about the past, and then you have what we call insight. Anastasia's point about being in the present, being stuck in the present. And so now today we have insight into COVID, into the disease, into the economic implications. And so as a school or as a business, we can make decisions in the present. The question is, can we develop foresight? Can we develop the ability not to look back, which is hindsight, but to look forward, which is foresight? So if I decided to travel on the N1 from Cape Town up to Johannesburg, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to travel on this highway, but I'm only going to make decisions based on what I see in my rearview mirror, or based on what I see on my left and my right. It's a matter of time before I get into an accident. Because what I would be doing is I would be making future decisions based on hindsight, which is back, and my peripheral vision or my insight, but I would be completely oblivious to what's in front of me, to foresight. But what's fascinating is most businesses, and I would say schools are quite similar, tend to make decisions based on the past. And so how does that work? We say we're going to have a strategy lekgotla, And what we really do is we take last year's budget and our staff, and we go on a bosberaad or a lagotla, and we define the strategy for next year, and we come back from there and we say the strategy for next year is last year plus 5%. So take the CapEx budget from last year, add 5%, right? What we're really doing is we're anticipating that the future will be the past with bells and whistles. And of course, we know that the world doesn't work like that. I was once talking to a school leader in a part of Pretoria, the city where I live, and they were saying that that the school has increasingly been looking, it's an NGO, and they've been looking after destitute children in this NGO, in this creche and primary school. But they're finding that some of the parents are showing up with SUVs, and they were saying, well, we don't understand, why are parents bringing children to our school using SUVs, using expensive cars? And then they began to understand that the city is changing, the suburb is changing, and as the city changes and as the suburb changes, the types of students that they get to their school starts to change. And so for them, instead of planning for the future based on what happened in the last 5 years, they need to plan for their future based on what's happening in the next 5 years. And so what we're going to be doing in the next hour or so is thinking about how do we plan for the future, but not based on the past. How do we plan for the future based on foresight? And how do we develop foresight? Now, I want to start by that process by touching on something that Anastasia has mentioned, which is vision, right? I'm going to put a picture on the board here. Let me actually start with this picture here. And let me see if I can tag someone. Yvonne, if I can come to you, Yvonne Johnstone. And after Yvonne Leone, let me ask you, if you look at this picture, Yvonne, what do you see in this picture? What's the story that this picture is telling you? I've unmuted you, Yvonne. You can go ahead. I'm sure we could hear you. Oh, there we go. There we go. You're unmuted. Go ahead.
Well, I see the future, travel, progress, and I'm pleased to see there's a female astronaut. So you could make a whole story out of that. And there's a robot. I hope we're not heading that way in the future, Marius. But it's very interesting that there's a little heart between the human and the robot. So perhaps there'll be that kind of connection in the future. You never know.
Thank you, Yvonne. Very interesting, right? That you picked up, obviously, what we see there. There's robots. You picked up the issue of gender, that there's a female astronaut, which is great. And then the issue of relationship and intimacy there, friendship between humans and machines. Now, what's fascinating about these pictures is these come out of movies, and these are depictions by human beings of what the future might look like. In some ways, they represent what we would call utopias. So the picture on the bottom left of a green belt, a green garden type spaceship somewhere in outer space. But in some ways, they also represent an element of dystopia, of an undesired future. So Yvonne's point there, Yvonne saying, I hope we don't head that way, referring to the robots. That there is a sense of maybe there's such a thing as too much technology. And I think during this time of COVID, one of the things we seem to have been grappling with is as we move our businesses online and virtual, and as we move our communities and our schools virtual, maybe we're moving to a future that has too much technology and not enough physiology, right? So I've got 3 little kids. How do I get my kids to hug their friends in a world of Zoom or MS Teams, right? And so these images of the future, these visions, contain both our hopes as well as our fears. They're complex composites of our hopes and our fears. Now, I did tag a second person here. I'm trying to find the name after Yvonne. Who was it that I tagged for a response to the picture? Was it Leonie?
It was Leonie, yeah, Marius.
Go ahead, Leonie, if you like. I'm just asking Leonie to unmute.
Right.
There we go.
I think I'm a little bit like one of the students in class that, you know, when the teacher is going to ask you, you go 45 degrees down with your eyes and just pray that it won't come your way. So I was muted and I stopped my video for intents and purposes. But here goes. I think looking at this, that there's an interaction, that is a very real interaction between technology and who we are. And that our landscape is going to change radically, and it is changing, and it has changed. And I must admit, it propelled us from words into action. So really, this particular slide talks very sharply to how schools had to go into Google Classrooms, for instance, using every form of technology, data or no data, to try and reach children, and not using hard copy because we just couldn't reach the children that way. So I'm obviously speaking from an educational point of view, but certainly that's what I see in the slide, is that it's not our future anymore. So if I now look at this, then I think, how did we never see this? Why did we think it was somebody's imagination? They spoke about artificial intelligence for years now, but we ignored it in education because we teach. We teach, and our fingers are still either with chalk, or we have these the ink from the whiteboard markers on it. So I do believe that the landscape has changed already, and we now just have to ask how we sharpen our tools. I don't think we will ever come off Mars. They're going to land the rover. I heard on the news just before I came into this meeting. They're very short of landing the rover to see if there was fossil remnants there. So that's my answer, is that I look at this, and this was very scary. If this meeting was a month or two ago, maybe in April, this would have been a futuristic answer I gave you, but now not anymore. This is it. This is the now. So I don't know if you have a picture of the future for us. So
thank you, Leonie. So thank you for that. So there is a sense in which, you know, some of the things that are happening now, we had a sense that they were coming. They were in our vision, but they weren't part of our action plan. We were aware, and you mentioned artificial intelligence. We were aware of its development and its presence, but we weren't, and we educators, many of us, we weren't integrating that knowledge into our agency, into our action plans. And so what foresight is about the ability to see futuristic things, but not only to see them and then tell your friend, oh, you won't believe what's happened. They're making a robot that can, you know, teach a class in cybernetic physics or something, but to anticipate that future and then to bring those insights into the present, to action them as a strategy. Now, I want to share with you a picture of a group of business leaders and educators who have not developed foresight. Let me take a moment here to share this image, and we'll see what we can learn from it. I'm going to share my audio here so that you can see that. That should come through any moment. Here we go.
Training fleas requires a glass jar with a lid. The fleas are placed inside the jar, and the lid is then sealed. They are left undisturbed for 3 days. Then, when the jar is opened, the fleas will not jump out. In fact, the fleas will never jump higher than the level set by the lid. Their behavior is now set for the rest of their lives. And when these fleas reproduce, their offspring will automatically follow their example.
So when I saw that video for the first time, I thought it was such a wonderful example of what management can be, or even in the education space, when we create institutions that teach us to jump a certain height. So you need to come and learn how to read and write. It's called numeracy and literacy. Then you need to develop some critical thinking, and then you need to become a good citizen of society and jump up and down by going to work at 9 and coming home at 4:30 or 5 o'clock. And if you do that, then you can earn an income and pay your taxes. And then the future arrives, which is a world in which, in my world right now, I'm working with counterparts in the US. And so when I have a meeting with them at 8 a.m., it's 5 p.m. for me. And so I need to learn to jump in different ways, right? This flea needs to go on a new learning curve. And as institutions, as businesses, and as schools, sometimes we have to take the lid off and we have to learn to jump in ways that we're not used to doing. Now, code, of course, is forcing us to do that with digital technology. But I think it's very likely in the next 10, 20, 30 years, the children that are coming through our institutions and the customers we have in 20, 30 years, they won't be expecting the same thing from us at all. I'll give you one example. So I have a 10-year-old son who loves playing a computer game called Fortnite. I'm sure many of you have heard of it and your kids will be playing it. And so he comes to me and he says to me, Dad, I need some V-Bucks. And so I say to him, what are V-Bucks? And he says to me, well, V-Bucks are like money, but they're money that you spend inside the game. So I say to him, okay, what do you want to do with the V-Bucks? And he says, well, I want to buy myself a skin. So I say to him, but you have a skin. Yeah, I can see it. Here you are. He says, no, you don't understand. I need a new skin. My old skin is boring and the other skins I have aren't cool. So I need a new skin. So then he explains to me that a skin is the outer cover of his virtual identity inside the game, and he needs V-Bucks to buy a skin so that his friends can play in the virtual world that they've created in a game, a part of the game called Creative. So here is a 10-year-old boy who is using virtual reality and digital technology, who is trading financially and is operating as a persona inside that virtual space. Now, if I take that 10-year-old and I say to him, son, in 5 years or 10 years, you need to go and open a bank account and you need to do business. But to do that, you need to go in a car to a building, walk in the room, talk to a person behind a thick glass pane, and you have to be dressed up in a particular kind of clothes. He's going to say to me, Dad, I want to make money in ways that aren't limited to buildings and bricks and paper money. I mean, think about paper, right? As a technology. I've got some paper in my back pocket here. This is a financial value, right? But the technology that we're using for this, it's called paper, or another word for it is thin wood. This technology was developed by the Egyptians, right? At the same time as that paper technology, the kids are trading financially in virtual space, and in some instances, they're using what's called cryptocurrency. And so the point is that we need to not only shift and learn to jump in new ways, but we need to prepare our institutions, whether it's our schools or our businesses, we need to prepare them to operate in a completely different environment. And so what we're going to do here in the next hour or so is facilitate a process of conversation to help us to make some of those changes and to become better at making some of those changes. Now, what I'd like to do is I'm going to share my screen. And we're going to do something similar to the polling exercise that you did earlier. We're going to use a slightly different tool to do the polling. And as educators, some of you will be familiar with the tool. Some of you will learn about it now and will use it in the future. What you should see if you look at your computer desktop is you should see a page with a question. And at the top of the page, there's a website mentioned. It's called menti.com. In fact, let me see if I can... there we go. I'll highlight menti.com with a code. And what you can do is you can use your cell phone on your internet browser, and you can go to menti.com, or you can use your computer internet and go to menti.com. And then it's going to ask you for a code, and you can put in the code 647811. And this is going to allow us to collectively participate in a quick polling exercise that's going to help us talk about the future. And so the question I've asked you there, the first question is a simple one. It says, in which province are you located? And so as you answer that, you'll see on the bottom right, the responses will come in. We've got 2 responses, and those will come rushing in, and we'll get a sense quickly of where in South Africa we're located. And then we'll get into some of the more substantive questions that will challenge us as we think about taking our school or our business into the future and preparing us for the future. So after 9 responses there, the Western Cape is dominating quite largely. KwaZulu-Natal coming through a few times there. Free State, Gauteng, bringing up the rear. And so we can get a good sense here of which provinces are represented. We're up to 22 responses. I use this tool just by way of background all the time in class, using it to engage my MBA students and others. Very powerful. And so after 30 responses, we see there mostly Western Cape, Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, but also Northern Cape, Eastern Cape, Free State, all represented. We'll give it a few more seconds here for responses to come in, maybe up to about 50. Make sure everyone's using the tool. If you're stuck, let me repeat it one more time. You go to the website menti.com on your cell phone or on your computer, and then you put in the code 647811. And that will allow you in the next 30 minutes or so to participate in the poll that we're going to do together. Give it a few more moments, see if we can get to 50 responses, and then we'll get into the substantive questions. $43. So I'm going to let the rest of you bring up the rear there for those who want to still participate in that question, and move to the next question here. The next question, you will be able to answer a bit like typing an SMS. You can write a sentence. And so the next question that I'm going to put to you here is the following. And you can answer this question more than once. What are the biggest uncertainties that you have faced in 2020? So what are the things that you've been most uncertain about? Is it, and these could be political, these could be economic, they could be social issues, they could be operational issues. What are the biggest uncertainties that you have faced in 2020? We'll use this to create a menu of topics for us to deal with as we grapple with the next year. Of course, this is completely confidential, and so you can be as honest as you like. No one else can see who said what. And so a few of them are coming through. Someone says job security, key uncertainty. Someone says school fees, political leadership, social issues, how to prepare my child for the future. Someone says budget. So operationally, how do I budget in a time of such uncertainty? Financial security. Someone says socioeconomic. And like I said, you can answer more than once. You can answer 3, 4, 5 times. Someone says health, government response, time frame, when things need to happen. So much disruption that the pace at which we're working seems to be disrupted. Work stability links to job security, health. Someone says the Western Cape. Someone says, that's probably from the previous question, how we work going forward, especially as our work entails face-to-face work. So a real uncertainty here about how are we going to work going forward. Someone says unprecedented change, financial change in particular, health. And so we're starting to see that actually the challenges that we're facing are sort of shared by the people around us, right? There are financial challenges, there's health challenges, there's operational challenges, there are some government challenges. Someone says an increase in corruption, so political and governance challenges. And then, of course, this big question around the future. Where are we going and what is our future? Big uncertainty. And then the last one here, educational issues. I've got a wonderful list of responses here. And we're up to 94 responses. Someone says food security, the ability of people to provide food. Indecisive leadership, so people struggling to make sense of the future. Now, I'm going to leave that question open, and you can continue to respond to that while I go back to my slide deck here for a minute and talk about why we have seen such a high level of uncertainty around us. And what I want to do to talk about that is to use a blank slide, a bit like a whiteboard, and to draw some pictures here. So what happens to us as we lead and as we manage organizations is we move from the past into the present and then into the future. And I'll put those up on the board here quickly. We've got the past, and that's what we used to do. We've got the present, and then we've got the future over here. Now, what happens is we tend to be very certain about the past because, of course, the past has happened. And so we know what happened. We've got the data. In fact, when we become certain about the past, we call that history. And some of you as educators teach history. Now, it's very interesting that we have a word for history. We have a word for describing the past, but do we have a word for describing the future? So do we have, what is the word we use in society when we want to talk about the future? Let me see if I can tag some people here. It's quite a philosophical question. Let me have a look here. Meredy Exon. Meredy, if I can ask you that question, we talk about the past as history, but when we talk about the future, how do we refer to that? Is there a word for what history is for the past? Is there such a word for the future, Meredy?
I can't really think of one. I think it's where we're going to, but I don't know another word.
Okay, so let's see. Thank you, Meredy, for that. It's a difficult question, right? Let me see if I come to Tessa Grobler. When we talk about the future, what do we call our stories about the future? Do we have a word that captures that?
Going with Meredy, I couldn't think of somebody, but of a word, but I saw one of the participants saying hope, and I'd like to go with hope. Because for me,
that
the future is hope. So it's not my word. It's not my word. I'm not taking credit for it. I just saw it pop up in the chat, and I thought, oh yes, that resonates.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that, and thank you for the person who posted it. So we do have a hope, and we might make that plural. We've got hopes, but then also, of course, we've got fears, right? These are sort of the projections we have of what the future might entail. Now, in the business world, or not in the business world, in organizations generally, we tend to refer to our preferred future as our vision. And that's the future we want to move towards. The problem is that the future is fundamentally uncertain, as we saw this year. And so the challenge is, in most organizations, is they try to work from the past to the present, and then through a series of decisions, they try to move to the preferred future or to their vision, right? And so we might call this here, let me change that there to be the preferred future. That's where most people's thinking is at, that it is about developing and finding some kind of vision for the future. Now, as a person who spends time helping organizations think about the future, what we actually say is that there is no such thing as the future. In other words, the singular future which is going to happen. Predicting the future is futile. Instead, what we do is we talk about what we call futures. We talk about multiple alternative futures that may or may not happen. I'm going to put that little letter there in S. In other words, the future is not like the past, which is singular, and we move from a past through the present into the future. Because of the way in which the future is contingent on our decisions, actually, there are multiple alternative futures, depending on what happens between now and then, right? Depending on what happens around us, depending on what we do, the future will materialize in very different ways. Now, because of that, we talk about, in the futures world, in the strategy world, we talk about this model that looks a bit like this, that we call the Cone of Plausibility. In other words, when we think about the future, there is no such thing as one future. And if I make that very practical, if your schools, is the future a future where Angie Mochecha decides to open the schools? Is it a future where she decides to close the schools? Is it a future where we open the schools and close them and open them and close them? Those are three very different futures. And those different futures have very different implications for our budget, for our staffing, and of course, very different implications for our school pupils. If we think about it from a business point of view, is the future one in which the US and China break up their relationship and Africa decides to do business with China rather than the US? Or is it a future where Donald Trump loses the election and the US and China begin to work much more closely together under Joe Biden, and South Africa gets to do business with the US and China and Europe? And as a business, depending on which of those futures materialize, we will have very different markets, very different environments in which we do business. And so what we do, instead of thinking about the future as a single future, we intentionally think about the future as multiple alternative futures. Now, you might say, but that's going to take an immense amount of time. And if you think about all these futures, when do we get to action? Well, the powerful thing is once we've thought about multiple alternative futures, we take the insights from those futures and we bring them back to the present and we use them to develop strategy. That is what scenario planning is about, and that is what strategic foresight, which is the field that I work in, is about. It's about taking those insights that arise from a particular future and bringing them back into the present to develop a strategy. Now, we're going to do that in the next 4 or 5 minutes or so. We're going to do that a little bit together and think about our various futures and what the implications of those might be for us. And I'm going to go for the moment back to our poll to ask another question, which is going to help us to think about our future. And the poll I'm going to put up is a question that says, and you can again go to menti.com using that code 647811. The question here is, who has the most influence in shaping your future operating environment? In other words, the environment in which your business operates, or in which your school operates, or your institution operates, who has the most influence in shaping that environment? And you've got, you can rank these different ones here. Do government officials have a very high level of influence or a very low level of influence? Do business leaders have a very high level of influence, very low? Community leaders, high or low? What about employees and internal stakeholders? Who's got the highest versus the lowest? What's their relative level of influence in shaping your future operating environment? And we'll see how this graph shifts and changes as the participants contribute in response to it. So we're up to 8 participants there. I'm sure they'll come through fast in the next few minutes. So after just about 20 responses, we're starting to see a bit of a pattern emerge, a bit of consensus about where the power and influence lies to shape the operating environment in which we find ourselves. While we're doing that, if I think back to our earlier poll, what are the key uncertainties? There's the key uncertainty about health, there's the key uncertainty about the economy, operational uncertainties. And so the question is, which of our stakeholders are most likely to shape this environment in which we operate? And what's emerging here after 45 or so responses is very interesting, that what we're saying is that government officials seem to have a higher level of influence right now. Now, that might be obvious to some of us, right? Because of COVID, because of lockdown regulations, that they've got a disproportionate influence in shaping our future, in shaping the future in which we operate. And then the second highest is business leaders. Business leaders will, of course, make decisions about investment, about employment, about whether to risk their capital. And depending on how they react, that will influence our employment, that will influence consumption in the economy. But it is interesting that community leaders are not without influence. They do have influence. And employees and internal stakeholders also equally have some level of influence. But what's emerging from this, and I'm going to take a quick screenshot here, what's emerging from this graph is that there's a consensus that really it's government leaders that seem to have a disproportionate influence in shaping our future. And that's got to do, I'm sure, with the, and I'm going to leave that graph open to those who are still answering, that's got to do with the way in which regulations are impacting our lives. Now, if I pull that graph into our discussion here and move it around here for a minute, what we're essentially saying is that this future that we're moving into, whether it's future A or future B or future C or future D, we agree that that future is probably going to be shaped by the role of government officials and business leaders as they impact the future in which we operate. Now, let me pause on that for a minute and come to the plenary here. Jackie, let me ask you first, and after Jackie, I'll come to Becky Scotta. Jackie, having listened to having read the responses from your colleagues here in the room about their uncertainties and about who's got influence in the environment, Jackie, what are the thoughts that causes you to think when you look out sort of in the next year, the next 2-3 years in your role? What are some of the implications that begin to come to mind for you?
Sure. So I'm really thinking about that. And for those that know me in the room will know that I don't say something unless I've kind of really processed some of my thoughts. But I guess what is maybe just kind of sitting there for me is a piece around. So I feel a bit conflicted by what I'm hearing, what I'm reading, and what I'm sensing within myself. And what I believe to be true around that influence lies within each of us and through the relationships that we build with one another. And I'm trying to, I'm working on a paradigm shift for myself that says it's not always those people over there, it's not the government officials or that it's business leaders, but actually I play a critical part in that because I have daily influence in terms of who I interact with and who I'm being. So I'm not really answering your question directly, but I'm just sharing a little bit of what my thinking is. And I think more than anything, I feel like I'm being called to really focus on what's within my influence, and I do believe that brings change, albeit at a micro, but it feeds into macro.
So that's a very interesting response. Thank you for that, Jackie. And it really lies at the heart of how we think about the future, because there are these alternative approaches. The one approach is to turn into our shell and to say, well, I have almost no agency. I've got very little what's called self-efficacy. And the government or the business community or the community will decide. And what then begins to happen, our relationship with the future becomes a relationship where the future happens to us. The alternative, which is what Jackie's sort of theorizing about, is that we say, actually, I have what we call a circle of control. Like I have a world, it's not the entire world, but I have a measure of influence and control, and not just control, but influence through my partners and network and the world around me. I can shape my future. And then there's a third place where these two worlds come together, where there's, at one level, well, government's going to make some rules and business is going to make some decisions, but I'm also going to make some decisions. And with my partners, we're going to innovate and adapt. And there's a place at which these two approaches come together, where in the field in which I work, we talk about the future emerging, where this is complex. It's in fact a complex adaptive system, to be technical, where the future emerges as a product about what they do alongside also what we do. And so I think about this COVID environment, and I as an educator, I wonder about how ready has the education sector been to take ownership and agency and adapt, not in an incremental way, in other words, making small adjustments to cope. So the psychologists will talk about coping, which is sort of doing the minimum to stay functional in an environment, versus thriving. Like how ready has the education system been to take agency and ownership, to adjust itself, to adapt fully so that it can in fact thrive as opposed to cope in this new environment? And so you're raising a very important point. Did you have a follow-on comment you wanted to add, Jackie?
No, I loved how you played that back and just added on some extra levels. Thank you.
Let me go here to Becky Scotta. your response, having listened to some of your colleagues, and I'll come to Tommy. I see Tommy's got a hand up. Go ahead, Becky. So I'm just unmuting Becky here. Becky, if you're able to hear us.
Yes, I am able to hear you.
Go ahead, Becky.
Yes, I think it's all for me in terms of where the environment that I'm working from is that I'm depending on the government to say, because I'm in the education system. So I feel that maybe there's no control on my side. I depend. For example, I cannot make decisions and say this is what needs to be done. The decisions that I will have to make will depend on what the superiors, if I may use that word, will say to me. For example, I cannot come tomorrow, for example, and change the whole school and say this is the direction that needs to go. Otherwise, I will be defiant. So I will say the future for me depends on the government officials. That is what they will say. For example, with my DGs and my directors and so on. And within the school, that is in the microcosm, within the school, as working from the management side, it will depend also with the principal and also the senior management, and therefore we take the decision as a collective. I'm not sure whether I'm answering you, but it's a very dicey one in terms of whom are you attached to, that is you depending to. For example, I don't know. I don't know whether I've answered the question correctly. That's my feeling. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Becky, you've said something very interesting, and you've inspired me to go on a small side journey here, because I think the contrast between Jackie's comment and your comment is so stark that it justifies us pausing here for a minute. And if you bear with me, let me share a thought with you about your comment there, Becky. And Becky was saying something about, I think to quote you, Becky, was saying something about not being able to make a decision because we have to wait for the superiors, and the government and the principal and the school. And what you inspire me to talk about for a moment is this question of, are we in a world where we are, on the one hand, free, or are we in a world where we are under the control of others? Now, it's very interesting. If you take a human being, if you take a person, let's imagine this, and I'm not going to have time here to draw a whole little stick man, but let me draw a small little stick man to talk about this. If you take a person, let's imagine this is a person, and you put that person in a world where they are completely free, where they're up here, and you say to them, you're in a pandemic, there's rules and things, you can't go to school, but you're completely free. And they're interested, let's say this person is interested to learn, they might say, well, the world is my oyster, the sky's the limit. I can use a smartphone to connect with a website, to download a curriculum, I can get my friends, and together we can co-create a community-based school of volunteers who can study and do whatever they want to do. If on the other hand, I have someone who is in a world down at the bottom right, where they are under control, and this person wants to learn, well, what this person is going to do is they're going to say, well, I have to wait for my boss, my leader, my minister, whoever that is. Now, why is this so interesting? Because as South Africa, we are, of course, a democracy. Now, what does that mean for us as a system? And we're going to talk about the future in a minute. What it means is that we have decided as a society, as South Africans, that we want to be free. We are completely free. Every man, every woman can decide what religion they want to do, what business. They're free. We're a free society. But we have put ourselves under the authority of a government in order for them to make laws and to organize us. Now, this raises, in a time of great disruption like a pandemic, this raises a very important question. And the very important question is, does government make the right decisions? And does it make those decisions in the right speed? And do they do, as government, do they do what the society needs them to do? And what will happen is, to the extent that those decisions that are made are correct, This group of people who are free will say, well, you know, the rules make sense. But controversially, and we're seeing this around the world during the pandemic with lockdowns, if governments do things that the society feel aren't correct or aren't ideal, it raises the question of, is there a moment where the free people in a context of a democracy decide, you know what, we have to take back some of that influence and power. And I'm not advocating here for civil disobedience or for revolution or protest. I'm talking about quite a profound philosophical point, right? If you're a parent or a community leader or a teacher or a principal, and your passion and responsibility is the education of your community, or if you're a business person serving clients and your passion is adding value to them and being successful in the process, what we are going to have to do is we're going to have to move from the bottom right, which is where we wait for the powers that be, and we have to move to the top left where we say, you know what, it's time for us to think for ourselves and work within the rules. Otherwise, what can happen, and I'm reminded here of the video we saw about the fleas. What can happen is we can become like fleas, right? So my wife and I are having this conversation where they opened the schools, our kids went back to school, and now they're closing the schools, and now our kids are back at home. And so we up to now, January to June, we've been jumping like fleas. But we're in a world where if I want my 11-year-old son to learn how to do robotics, I can enroll him in a curriculum in Japan. And if I want my daughter, who's very creative, who's 7-year-old, to learn about design, I could probably use a homeschooling curriculum to get her that knowledge. And again, I'm not advocating for one form of schooling versus the other. What I'm asking us to think about is, how do we move in our mind from this bottom right, where the world and the future is something that happens to us, to the top left, where we break out of that thinking and we say, what is the future that we desire? Now, if I come back to this model for a minute, we're saying to one degree, we understand government does have a high level of influence about our future. But I want to suggest to you, and this is key for education and for business, that future where government determines the pace and the shape of education, and where government determines the shape and the pace of business, that is one future. Let's call that the government-led future. Now, this is quite important because we see this in the education system, but also in the economy. It happens to be the case that in South Africa, we do have a government who wants to be the leader of society, who thinks of itself as the leader of society. But there's other societies outside South Africa where that's not the way they see it, where you have community-led approaches. And then I'll even go a step further. If you take the case of the US, which is a bit of an extreme case, you have a market-led approach. And depending on which way we go, we end up with very different futures. I would, as a foresight person or as a scenario planner, I would venture to say, and we can talk again in November, December, but I think it's probably the case that government is going to, in South Africa, lock down the schools and then open them up and then lock them down again. And the reason I say that's going to happen is, if I think about who has power and influence, I think government has quite a bit of power in South Africa, but people like unions, community leaders, communities of workers also have lots of power. And between those two, the question is, will they be risk-taking or will they be conservative? My assessment is it's probably the case that both of them are going to be conservative in response to the pandemic. The implication of that is they're going to lock down and open up and lock down. And if I ask the question, will we be able to complete the curriculum by the end of the year in public schools? I think it's probably no. On the other hand, and I'll come to the person who's raised the hand, business in South Africa is probably going to be less conservative because it's it's in a position where it's losing money, it can't do business, the market is constrained, and business has to come out of that by taking risks and breaking out of that mold. And so it's probably going to be the case that the private sector, and in this case, the private sector of the education system, is going to have a slightly different response to the next 6 months. And at the level of the curriculum is probably going to have a slightly different set of outcomes. So let me finish that point by saying this. I would not be surprised if a 12-year-old who is in a private school uses a combination of government and other curriculum to finish their year, while a 12-year-old who doesn't have those benefits is forced to wait for the decisions that are made by government at a particular time. Now, let me, before I take that comment of the person who raised their hand, let me say, the purpose of this is not to have a political conversation. We're thinking about what do the next 6 months to a year look like for us and our world. And so Becky, I'm going to come back to you in a minute for a response, but there was a hand up. Let me see here quickly. Tommy had a hand up, and then there was another hand up. Let me see if I can find it. I don't see the other hand. Tommy, please unmute and go ahead, and then we'll come back to Becky in a minute.
Thank you, Marius. I was tempted in the results of the poll in terms of the most influential sector in terms of decision making or implementation of the future that is being determined for us. I was of the opinion that largely it's business that determines, that is my opinion, determines the future, and the government implements the desires and aspirations of the business. Hence, as of now, we are having the opening and the closing and the opening and the closing and undecisive moves that are being made by the government during this pandemic era and the likes. And this pandemic, fortunately or unfortunately, it made us to realize that who is at the center stage of making the decisions for the future of everybody around the country. And having said that, it becomes sort of very much evident in terms of decisions that have been taken and being sort of outlaid to the community without having judged or ascertained as to whether will they be implementable or what. But now the problem is those decisions being fed up to the government. The issue is the implementation part of it has to come into the communities. How are they going to be implemented? It becomes difficult because it is business pressuring government having to implement whatever desires of the business, so that everybody can, there is no balance, let me say. There is no balance in terms of implementing of those decisions and the like. And that in itself, unfortunately, gets down to the community. You know, you have spoken a lot after the latter speaker there. That made my mind to run a lot. I was going to say that even at school level, the gentleman mentioned the issue of deciding, making decisions at school level. We are at latitude to can do that. We have policies, we have regulations and everything that surrounds the school. And as the team at school that is leading the school, including the SGB, we are also at liberty to can make some decisions in line with what are the guidelines of the business, I mean of the government. And having that, you can stand your position besides the one that is being being delegated by the government to can implement, because you are living in a situation that you are experiencing on daily basis, and you will be planning according to the situation that you are living in and trying to get to changes that will help the community that you are living in and the community that you are working with. And in that, you can stand your position to case.
Thank you, Tommy. I'm looking at the time. You want to take another minute, Tommy, and then we'll hear from Nsebakazi, if that's okay.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Tommy, if you want to take another minute to finish your comment, and then we'll go to another hand here, and Nsebakazi's also got a comment.
Okay, let us give him a chance.
Thank you, Tommy, and thank you for that. And I'm going to come back to the point you're making about decisions being made at a certain level, and then implementation has to happen with community. So thank you for that. And Sebakasi, please go ahead.
Hi, Marius. Thank you. Thinking about where our future is going, just thinking about how South Africa is, we have communities that we are not equal, right? So you made an example of students studying for themselves, going to the internet. And I was just thinking that poor people are going to be left behind in the future, because not all of us have access to the internet. And then those people will have to wait for the government to make decisions for themselves. If people were equal, then it would be maybe easier for everyone to do like the same thing and go in the same direction. But now, because we are unequal, some people will be moving forward and others will have to wait for the government to make decisions for themselves, because they do not have the resources to help them.
Sebakazi, thank you for that comment. And you have actually touched on something which I want to use here to close before we come to some Q&A and some opportunities for you to ask questions and for us to finish our discussion. When I look at this graph we were talking about different kinds of futures that might develop in the next few months, in the next few years, and who will shape those futures, I think what I'm hearing us discuss is that there are 4 different possibilities. The first possibility is, on the one side here, is to wait on government. And that has very broad implications in a society like South Africa. Does government have the resources? Does it have the capacity? Does it make the right decisions? Does it have its own challenges? The alternative, instead of waiting on government, is for communities to take charge. Where communities that doesn't mean that they don't wait on government and don't work with government, but they take a much more active approach to shaping the future that they want. Now, that's the first, what I would call, key uncertainty facing South Africa, facing business, facing schools. The second key uncertainty is here at the top. Do we go it alone? In other words, do we let the poor people who are not equal figure it out for themselves, and wealthy people, people with means, focus on their own interests? Or do we co-create a future together? And this is about partnership, about collaboration. And what then happens from this, and this is coming from the conversation we're having, on the one side, there's a future here on the top left, which is future number 1, where in this future, we are waiting on government, and we say, well, is the school going to open? Is it going to close? Is the economy going to open? Is it going to close? Is there going to be jobs or not? And we go it alone. And this is the future where I think it's probably the case that South Africa will be divided. Schools will be hampered. Development will be held back. And business will struggle. This is a future in which, as South Africans, we're really waiting on the world to change, but we're waiting for government to change the world while we wait on the world to change. Then on the top, or on the bottom left, there's a future here where we wait on government, where we say, well, government's got to come with a solution for our school, for a solution for COVID, for a solution for the economy. But we do have a spirit of Ubuntu, and we do pull together and work together. And this is probably a future that is a slow-moving future where government, we get technology in schools when government decides to buy the technology. We get a digital curriculum when government has the resources to give us that curriculum. We get the rich schools and the poor schools, or the successful businesses and the unemployed, to work together when government comes up with a policy. This is a slow-moving environment where our resources are constrained, and where where our partnerships are formal partnerships and they're quite limited partnerships. So this is a world where the school in, let me just fix that spelling there since we're educators, let's get it right. This is a future in which the school in the affluent community will talk to the school in the underprivileged community, but only when there's a government program to cause them to do that. Then on the top right, and I'm going to wrap up here very soon in a couple of minutes, there's a future where communities take charge, but we go it alone. And this is a future where schools with limited resources, where business leaders with small markets struggle next to each other. And this is a future where, you know, poor schools find a way where even in spite of COVID, in spite of the shutdowns and the challenges, we find a way to get through the curriculum. We probably put kids through school. We find a way to do digital, even if it means with very little data, very little bandwidth. And businesses find a way to keep the business going, but they've probably downsized and they've limited their product offerings and their service offerings. And then there's a future here. In fact, let me make that one blue. Then there's a fourth future, which I see coming out of this conversation, a future for South Africa, where we find synergies between different partners, and let me get that spelling right, and we leapfrog as a consequence. So I had a conversation with Louise van Rijn over an SMS a while back, and I said to her, you know, Louise, imagine if the cell phone companies and the banks joined hands with the post office and the schools, and local businesses got on board, and we brought a quality digital curriculum to every community instantly with zero-rated data. South Africa has the means. We could do that within 3 months. What we would lack is the leadership and the partnership and the energy to materialize that vision. And so the question, I think, and I'll end with this, and then we'll have some questions and answers. The question is, do we stay up here on the top left-hand side where we're waiting on government and we're going it alone? Or do we find a way as leaders, given our future challenges, to move to the bottom right where we can unlock all kinds of potential new opportunities? And so these are some of it is complex, but these are some of the challenges I think we're facing. I hope that the last hour or so have been helpful to you as we think about the future and talk about the future. I've tried to sort of break up the ground so that new things can grow. But let me stop there and give over to you, Justin, and you can facilitate us through some Q&A.
Marius, thank you very much for that incredible insights. I've been taking notes here, and I was just thinking that it's a problem emceeing a talk by a scenario planner. You end up with 40 pages of notes all over the place, and you're not quite sure where to go. But what really has struck me, and I want to go here with these questions. So if you've got questions for Marius, you can pop them into the chat, and then Luba's going to get them through to me, and I'm going to start reading them out. So let us really get into some detail here with Marius. He said a tremendous amount. And he's made some incredibly useful points. And I'm going to kick this off, Marius, because I've got something very specific that I'd like to ask you. So you've talked about these 4 quadrants, and really you've talked about how can we as a citizenry retain or regain agency. How can we become active citizens? How can we become people who take back that control to some extent? And you mentioned the circle of control. And I would like you to give us just a couple of thoughts off the top of your head of how can we extend this circle of control? I think some of us feel like we'll never shift out of that first quadrant, or from that, you know, we're being dictated to by government. And the battle must start somewhere. Is it in the mind? Is it with groups of people in community? What's a first step that we can take to extend that circle of our control?
Thank you, Justin. That's a great question. I think that there are a couple of things to say in response to that, and some of them are quite philosophical in some ways. That it raises the question, why do people feel powerless in the face of others who make decisions on their behalf? And in fact, psychologists have a concept that they refer to as power distance, which is, and we measure this in different societies, where we say, what is the level of power distance in the society? And what power distance is about is, if the principal says, thou shalt, how willing are we to obey them, right? That's what power distance is about. And it happens to be the case in South Africa that we live in a society with a very high level of power distance. In other words, we have been taught by our society to say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, right? And we were taught that through religion. We were taught it through politics. Even as a white South African, under apartheid, you were a very obedient citizen, even though the state was pro-white people and was a police state towards black people. All citizens were under a powerful state. And this created power distance in South Africa. And so one of the things we have to do, I think, is to disabuse ourselves of this idea that someone else runs our lives. That as South Africans, it is a liberation of the mind, that we realize, you know what, this is my life, this is my country, these are my fellow citizens. And it starts with being empowered in the way we think about the world. Now that requires a change in our thinking, and we have to watch ourselves. If we're saying to ourselves, let's wait for the government, maybe that requires a conversation with ourselves to say, but that's our government. We give that government a mandate. And it's up to us then to make sure that the mandate it has and it's exercising is in line with our wishes. And so it is about, and that's my second point, it is about taking back the power to determine our future. And again, psychologists refer to this as self-determination, or political scientists refer to it as self-determination. You have the power to determine your future, but you have to take that power and use that power. And by saying that, I'm not saying we should be in conflict or oppressing anybody through the use of power. We should use our power, and I'll finish with this. It is about taking that power and using it responsibly for those under our care. And as a school leader, as a business leader, we have people under our care. We've got customers, we've got employees, we're responsible for them. And so we have to take charge and exercise our power to execute that responsibility we have towards our community.
Thank you, Marius. So for the educators in the room, really what I'm getting from you is it's a matter of taking back our power, taking back some of our control over the situation, but perhaps starting by changing our minds to be able to say, we actually do have this. We've got this. We are free. We are a free country. I think sometimes we tend to forget that. We've earned the right to call ourselves free. And how can I exercise my freedom as a principal, as an educator, as a business leader, to be able to take back that agency? So the encouragement or the invitation as we look forward is to take back that power and take back that agency. So thank you for that. Whilst we're just looking at the questions coming through from Luba, just to say, if you need to leave early, please do fill out the evaluation. It's on the chat. Nonhlanhla, thank you for putting that out. And please do take a moment just to click on that link and fill out your evaluation. It's very important for us in terms of gathering data. So I've got a question here that says, once we have some idea of ideas of the possible futures, what questions should we be asking ourselves to build the strategy to get to an ideal future or vision? What are the questions we should be asking ourselves to build that?
That's a great question. And so articulating the alternative possible futures is only the first step, right? So practically, if there's a future for education, where education is digitally empowered, versus a future where education is traditional, our response to that has to become a strategy. Now, the question there points to how do we do that? How do you turn that future into a strategy? And it's very simple. In fact, what you do is you ask yourself, in each of those different futures, what would be the competencies that would make me successful? So I'll give you an example. If the future of the global economy is dominated by the US and Europe, and I look at my son who's 10 years old and I say, what would be the competencies that he needs to thrive in a future that is dominated by the US and Europe? Well, then the answer is he needs to be able to speak English. But if the future of the global economy is dominated by Asia and China, well, he might need to speak Mandarin. That's the competency. If our future is dominated by Africa, because 1 billion Africans get educated and wealthy and trade with each other, well, then my son needs to learn to navigate the African environment. And so if I want to prepare him for the futures, plural, I have to say to him, son, you may need to travel the continent, get to know Africa. You may need to learn a bit of Chinese customs and a bit of Mandarin, but you better learn English as well, because if you have those 3 competencies, irrespective of which future unfolds, you are very, very likely to be well prepared for that future. And so as a business, there are competencies you can develop for different futures. And similarly, as a school, developing those competencies will empower you to respond to any of those futures that unfold.
Okay, so the encouragement, and we've got time for another couple of questions, so please do feel free to pop those onto the chat, and whatever is on your mind, we'd be more than happy to put it to Marius. But I think the invitation then is, and we're looking at business leaders on this particular webinar, and school principals and educators, is to kind of lean into this idea that if we have power and agency, that we can look into the future and look at scenarios that may unfold in time. And I look at COVID-19 and I go, well, there are definitely scenarios that I could project might happen and be able to kind of think back to the present about how I could respond. So I really want to just carve out that invitation or space for invitation for our particular educators to know that they can sit together with staff and with communities and they can project forward. That they have the power to do that, they have the ability, they have the community members and the agency to do that. And then they can also feel that there is some form of, in a completely uncontrolled environment, some form of control that they might be retaining. And that leads me, I'm going to put you on the spot here, Marius, if I can. This is not a scenario planning question or something projected forward because we're in it, but I know it's an area amongst our educators is that we're talking about the 4th Industrial Revolution. And you know that picture that you showed of the future and you know that wonderful point that it's actually the present. And a lot of our educators are saying we need to prepare for the 4th Industrial Revolution. We need to get prepared for this thing. And invariably the conversation turns around on them and says, yeah, but we're in it. We're in this thing. I would love you to give our, particularly these educators, some idea of what can we do to prepare for this or start thinking differently about this in particularly under-resourced environments?
Thank you, Justin. I think that to echo your point, we're in the midst of the 4th Industrial Revolution, but I would add one more issue to that, and that is that because we're in South Africa, in Southern Africa, and in Africa and part of the global South, which is of course South America, Africa, and Asia, we're not only in the 4th Industrial Revolution, in many ways, we're in the 1st Industrial Revolution. So the 1st Industrial Revolution was an energy revolution where we discovered steam energy. And the second one was mechanization, machines. And the third was, of course, computers. Now, if you think about Africa with 1 billion people, 750 million Africans have no electricity on a daily basis. They live in what's called energy poverty. So the 1st Industrial Revolution still needs to reach 750 million of the billion Africans that we live with on the continent. And so when we come to your question of how do we prepare, the challenge for South African students is preparing for a world in which we have to bring ourselves up to speed with the 1st Industrial, 2nd Industrial, 3rd Industrial, and 4th Industrial Revolution all at the same time. And that actually is a very exciting thing, because if you think about it, 100 years ago, if you wanted to build a power station, it had to be government, it had to take 10 years, it had to be a large coal-fired power station like Medupi and Kusile. Today, if you want to give a poor community electricity, you need a solar panel, a battery, an inverter, and a 16-year-old who knows how to connect them. Now, if you take that solar panel, that little grid, and you connect it to other grids, you can connect that to the intranet and you call it a smart grid, where that electricity grid talks to the rest of the grid and it shares electricity across the community. And so as educators, we have to ask ourselves, I think, two questions. The first question is, what is the kind of world in which our pupils are going to grow up? And I do think it's a world where energy is going to play a critical role, renewable energy, where mechanization and industrialization is going to play a critical role, where computers will play a critical role, and then, of course, digital technology will be added to that as the cherry on top. The second question we need to ask is, what is the kind of work that our pupils will do in that environment? And the simple answer is, it will be a spectrum. Some of them will do very basic things like welding and engineering. Others will do very sophisticated things like programming. But I think the one thing that all students in 20, 30, and 40 will have in common is the need to be able to be creative in a project type environment, because the world is changing so quickly that long projects are becoming short projects that change in rapid succession. And so if we can prepare young people, and I'll come to your point quickly about constrained resources, if we can prepare young people to add value in that process and be creative in that process, they will find themselves an entrepreneurial niche where they can succeed. And I think in a resource constrained environment, the key is to say, what are the problems that our community faces, and where are the resources to address those problems? Because if we can expose our pupils to addressing those problems with the limited resources at our disposal, we would be teaching them the meta skills that I've been describing that they're going to need in the future.
So thank you, and you allude there to this creative future, and what interests me about that is just linking it back to co-creation. That we are certainly entering a period of the absolute necessity for partnership. Going into the future, and I've noticed that on some of the chats that are starting to come through, even when it looks hopeless, when the situation looks overwhelming, like we have no control, suddenly the ideas start to flow, and it invariably starts with those magic, I guess, scenario planning words of what if. You know, what if we partnered with SABC to do X, Y, Z? What if we used a smartphone? What if we brought business leaders and schools together in a relationship? And so I guess where I'm going with this is that where there is a sense of hopelessness, the first step for any of us is going to be to step out and to partner in a co-creation conversation of some kind. Even if that is around things that are frightening to us, like the lack of knowledge of the fourth industrial revolution, or how do we access power? Even in under-resourced schools, when we feel hopeless, there is a partner, there is somebody that we can reach out and make contact with. From Karen, what if the private schools partner with the less fortunate schools to get the year completed? We have a wonderful example of that here in KZN, where one of the private schools has opened their classroom to the government schools for the kids to come in and learn together. I mean, there's a social impact and an educational outcome that would never happen if it wasn't for the crisis of COVID-19. And I think that probably brings me absolutely to the last thing. I'd love you to close off, Marius, just with my sense is that there are so many gifts from this pandemic. And I know we're focused on the negatives, environmental, the health destruction, but from the point of view of how you're seeing the future, how you're planning forward, what are some of the positive aspects of this thing that you can leave us all with to give us a sense of hope as we navigate the next weeks and months?
Thank you, Justin, for that. And I think I'll finish with two thoughts. The first is quite a practical one relating to technology. I think that as South Africans, we have a very high level of inward lookingness. That's not really a word, but we tend to be quite inward focused. And I experience this all the time when I travel around the world, come back to South Africa, and I listen to the conversations we have as South Africans. It's about our problems, our issues inside South Africa. And what the pandemic has done is it's forced us to realize that, hold on a second, we're not limited to our office or our school building. You know, here we are, we're talking with 100 people during this session from across the country. we're part of a community that's not just limited to physical space. Now, I think as South Africa, the pandemic is forcing us to break the mold of our little world and be part of a bigger world. And I think as a country, as businesses in particular try to reach out through technology to other markets, to other jurisdictions, I think schools are going to have to do the same thing, is to break the mold and say, how do we partner? Yes, partner with a school down the road, but imagine if we partnered with a school in in Bridgeton in the UK, or a school in Colorado in the US. These things are possible today. I think the second one, which is linked to the first, is a more practical one. You know, we live in a fairly nice suburb in the city where I stay, but very near to us is a community that during the pandemic has experienced food poverty, where 4 kilometers of people were queuing for something as basic as food. And I think what the pandemic is doing is it's forcing us, not just in South Africa, but around the world, to stare in the face some of the fundamental differences in inequality and some of the social issues we face. And I hope that through this time will come the innovation to say, you know what, how do we lift those people out of that poverty? How do we create opportunities for them? And how do we create a better world? I think the Secretary General of the United Nations has called this the Great Reset. It is an opportunity for us to step back and reflect about the way the world is that we've made and say, how do we make it better? How do we make it different? And so if we can harness that opportunity, our schools and our businesses will be better off. And I think in the long term, of course, our kids will be better off as well.
So thank you for that, Marius. That I think there's such encouragement to be taken from this notion of the Great Reset. And it is challenging. Of course it's challenging, and we're all feeling this on a daily basis, but we're being given this gift of an opportunity to reassess everything and to reprogram our thinking towards different outcomes and different solutions. And of course, that leaves me really just to thank you very much. I think that the value of sessions like this for all of us is that it does shake us. It does break us out of our current mold of thinking.